Everything I'm going to project onto that screen is available on the internet for you to look at, download, play with, do anything you wish. It's accessible at, if you take my last name, it's on your sheets, Dysinger, add an L for Luke, ldysinger.com. If you go there, you will find a screen that looks like this. Those are courses that I teach at St. John's Seminary. And if you drop down, right down here, HV50, that is a link that will take you to everything we're going to look at today. Now, this is a talk that I gave to clergy. The talk we're going to be looking at is a link here. But actually, everything's on the left, and you can access everything from there. But if you click right here, the encouragement of NFP in Amoris Laetitia, there we are. That's everything I'm going to be sharing today. And the links are there on the left. We are living in an exceptionally exciting moment from the perspective of teaching natural family planning. And in addition to my scheduled topic, that is using Amoris Laetitia, knowing what the document actually says, being able to look at portions of it and remind people of those portions who might have a somewhat different approach to the document. In addition to that, I'd like also to highlight the fact that we are at an exceptionally exciting moment because there are, and we'll say this again a little later in the talk, about 800,000 women in Europe, mostly in the UK, in England, who are using an app that was developed by two physicists who effectively sort of think they've discovered the symptothermal method. But they haven't, of course. They've just begun to do something which people are pretending is something new. Now, my mentioning that is not because we would recommend it, but you will encounter women who are using it. You will find more and more women, and I'd say this especially to the priests and those involved in ministry here, you will find women already using secular apps of one kind or another. And if you know about natural family planning, if you know the teachers who live in your parish or in your deanery or to whom you feel comfortable referring people, then you will be able to say to those people, you know what, actually our church has been looking at this issue for a long time, and we have a lot of good scientific research and people you can talk to with the questions you cannot ask of your app. So in many levels, we are being provided with an opportunity. And my advice is carpe diem, seize the day, seize the opportunity. And we'll look at that. We'll look at where this app is and how it kind of fits in to our history. What I'd like to do today, and we'll see if we can squeeze it all in, is to look at the perspective of natural family planning as it exists in this wonderfully controversial document, Amoris Laetitia, from a couple of perspectives. One is the history of natural family planning, because Amoris Laetitia places itself in a historical continuity of magisterial teaching and cites any number of documents as a way of saying, this is our tradition and this is how we're going to try to live it out now. So to understand that history can be helpful, and there's another reason for understanding that history. Many, if not most, perhaps all of you, have encountered the kind of foot-dragging reluctance, often on the part of clergy, to even raise the question of natural family planning. I'd like to help us understand why that is the case. And it isn't just because priests don't want to talk about sex. It also has to do with the history of when Humanae Vitae was published, when it appeared, and what was and was not available at that time. There was the creation of a mindset, of a whole kind of model of misunderstanding, which is still present today, and which, again, I believe we have the opportunity of intervening in and changing and modifying. So now I am a historian, and I'm biased towards believing that these things are worth knowing on their own, in their own right, but I think there's a very good reason for understanding the period in which Humanae Vitae first appeared, because it will help you be compassionate and help you move forward with people who seem to be reluctant because they're stuck in a mythology that comes from the late 1960s. Okay, so we'll look at the history. We probably won't have an opportunity to look in much detail at the issue of eugenics and how Amoris Laetitia and also Humanae Vitae addresses that question, but we will certainly look at three prominent themes that are important in the teaching of natural family planning and are present and emphasized in Amoris Laetitia. And those are the themes of self-mastery and nature, naturalness, on the one hand, accompaniment, the importance of having a living, breathing human being with whom you can speak and of whom you can ask questions when you've got difficulties. That is a powerful theme throughout Amoris Laetitia, and interestingly, specifically in the context of the discussion of natural family planning, which occurs in this document. And third, or fourth, is the principle of gradualness, the pastoral principle of recognizing that when you are proposing to people a way of living, a model of asceticism, which is what it is, that is so unlike anything they've done before, you have to be patient, you have to work with them, and you have to set yourself in a pattern of a goal that will occur over time. Change will not be immediate, it may be glacial, it may be slow, but to be with people to help them and to always point towards the goal is essential. That is a theme in Amoris Laetitia as well. So those of you involved in the teaching of natural family planning know how important these three themes are: self-mastery, accompaniment, and the principle of gradualness. It may amaze you to discover that they are all powerful themes in this document as well. Well, let's say a little word about Amoris Laetitia. Why did I even feel it was helpful to raise this question? And I've begun with a quote from The Lord of the Rings. One of the greatest Catholic theologians of the 20th century was J.R.R. Tolkien. Profoundly deep and pious Catholic, he disagreed with his good friend C.S. Lewis about how to communicate moral theology and Christian spirituality. He didn't believe in allegory. He didn't believe in creating a character that would say, the lion is Jesus. Instead, Tolkien believed that if you tell a myth well, and it is based in the reality or the images or the beautiful complexity of the world that God has created, it will also communicate profound and deep and beautiful moral values. So Tolkien has a different approach, and his literary model is rather different. I've quoted from a section of The Lord of the Rings where there's a battle going on, and suddenly it turns out there's a battle within the ranks of the good guys. Not just between Sauron and the defenders of Middle-earth, but the good people are fighting against one another, and Gandalf, the wisdom figure, says, work of the enemy. Such deeds he loves. The enemy loves this. Friend at war with friend. Loyalty divided in confusion of hearts. And I think there's been a lot of loyalty divided and confusion of hearts with regard to Amoris Laetitia. It is unquestionably the most controversial document of the Catholic magisterium to appear since Humanae Vitae. There has been more ink spilt about it, there has been more controversy, there have been more angry blogs on both sides of the question in the Catholic blogosphere than really any other document in recent times. And that makes it a kind of an almost sparking, fascinating cauldron, which challenges us in many ways. Let me tell you a secret as an historian. I always tell my students this. Every Catholic, in order to develop into good spiritual maturity, should have the experience of living through a pontificate they do not enjoy. And I mean that. Because if you look back at the history of our church over the last not just 200 years, but 500 years, the majority of Catholics throughout human history have had that experience. In other words, they have learned how to be loyal to the magisterium, to the teaching authority of the church, to Christ working through the teaching authority of the church, even if they don't particularly like the way things are being expressed at the moment, even if they have a problem with the kind of language that the Holy Father himself may be using. And that brings us to the language and the principles of Amoris Laetitia. We live in an era in which the most learned theologian to sit in the See of Peter in at least 500 years, Benedict XVI, was preceded by the most learned philosopher to sit in the See of Peter for the last 500 years, Pope St. John Paul II. We have had decades of fantastically careful, well-grounded, polished theology coming from the mouth and the pen of the Holy Father deliberately, because these were theologians. These were people who knew they had to make absolutely sure that every word they said would be crystal clear and vetted and would be completely in harmony with the tradition. Pope Francis is a pastor. He comes directly from the confessional. He comes directly from the experience of working with people, and he loves off-the-cuff statements, which unfortunately tend to be quoted in part rather than in full. So people don't actually hear the whole context of what he said, and they make all sorts of, or draw all sorts of conclusions, usually based on what they want him to have said, rather than what he actually did say. But he speaks off the cuff. There's this whole new genre of papal interviews, interviews with people who don't write down the interview and then later reconstruct it and end up publishing it in various kinds of places, and then people say this is what the Pope said. But Pope Francis doesn't mind. He does not mind trying to address issues in ways that raises a certain amount of controversy, not to make hearts unsettled, but to make sure everybody is heard. His is the language of pastoral theology. His predecessors spoke and worked in the language of moral theology, of canon law, and of systematic theology. He is concerned with trying to refine things or make them understandable or applicable to the people who are coming to confession and coming to counseling and spiritual direction. And so he has a tendency to use language often that is not as precise as we would care for. But in Amoris Laetitia, in fact, he is careful. This is a document that occurred after 2 synods on the family. 1 synod was not enough. Getting together the bishops and advisors to discuss issues of family on 1 occasion wasn't sufficient, had to happen again the following year. The results were collated, adapted, and then published under the authority of the Holy Father, and that's what we have in Amoris Laetitia. A lot of people have quoted the most controversial and difficult sections of this document, dealing with the very complicated question of what you do with and how you deal with and what you recommend to the divorced and remarried with regard to their participation or non-participation in the sacraments. But in fact, there's a lot more to this document than that. So let's take a look at 1 or 2 little sections. First of all, natural family planning is specifically mentioned in Amoris Laetitia, chapter 222. This is a long document, not a short thing at all. In Amoris Laetitia 222, he situates this document in light of, in continuity with, Humanae Vitae on the one hand, and Familiaris Consortio on the other. Pope Paul VI's 1968 document, and also Familiaris Consortio, Pope St. John Paul II's document on family, which covers many and describes many of the themes that will be reiterated again in Amoris Laetitia. Well, let's look at what it actually says. Okay, this is a direct quote. The pastoral care of newly married couples must also involve encouraging them to be generous in bestowing life. So generosity in bestowing life is a foundational principle of our understanding of interpersonal relationship in marriage and the attitude of a couple. And this is a quotation, in accord with the personal and fully human character of conjugal love, family planning fittingly takes place as a result of, and in my own little version of Amoris Laetitia, I've divided this up into 1, 2, 3, a consensual dialogue between the spouses. It is to involve conversation. Family planning is not just something one partner or the other does. It's something that arises out of conversation, out of communication. Consensual dialogue, respect for times, an awareness of the cycle of fertility that exists within the woman, and consideration of the dignity of the partner. Nothing forced. Nothing forced. Consideration of the dignity of the partner. In this sense, the teaching of the encyclical Humanae Vitae and Familiaris Consortio ought to be taken up anew. And that same section, which hopefully we'll have a chance to come back to again, ends with the following statement. Moreover, the use of methods based on the laws of nature and the incidence of fertility are to be promoted. So we are to promote, we are to encourage, we are to teach methods of natural family planning since, again another quote from the Catechism, these methods respect the bodies of the spouses, encourage tenderness between them, and favor the education of an authentic freedom. That's a pretty strong recommendation of natural family planning, and a very beautiful summary of several of the most important underlying principles. Dialogue between the spouses, respect for one another, and respect for the natural cycles that exist within the marvelous complexity of the woman's body. So all of that is contained in that one little section. Now, the Pope has chosen to situate this document in a kind of historical context by mentioning Humanae Vitae, by mentioning Familiaris Consortio. So let's allow ourselves to put this observation in the context of the history of natural family planning itself. And the subtopic for this, or the subtitle for this portion is, why the opposition? Why the dragging of feet? Why do you encounter so many clergy and people in positions of authority who don't think natural family planning works, who don't want to talk about it? Why? It's understandable. Let's look a little bit at the history of the development of natural family planning. The oldest method with which people are probably familiar is the so-called rhythm method, charting based on a calendar. And this was the result of research by a Japanese and a German physician who published their data beginning in the 1930s. And their work, which then was continued during this period, resulted in what has subsequently become known as the rhythm method. Now, this is not something that, people will sit back and say, oh, the rhythm method, it just doesn't work, didn't work. It depends on regularity of a woman's cycle. It's based on an attempt to predict what will probably happen based on what happened during a woman's last cycle. So if a woman has very irregular cycles, the rhythm method will not be as successful for her as it would be for someone who has very, very regular cycles. It has not been completely abandoned as something medieval and false and problematic. This is a picture of the standard days beads, which is the basis of cycle beads. If you look up cycle beads, you will find that people at Georgetown University have attempted to develop a form of the rhythm method that doesn't depend on charting, but is much more kind of tactile, much more developed as a way of anticipating what's likely to happen during the coming month, probably for women primarily in the developing world who would find charting difficult. Now, this is not necessarily something we would feel comfortable recommending, but this is a reminder that even in our own day, this was introduced in 2002, the rhythm method is not entirely obsolete or bad, but it does depend on the regularity of a woman's cycles, and if a woman's cycles are irregular, it will not be as successful. Now, it was the only form of natural family planning that was widely known at the time Humanae Vitae was published. When your average parish priest read Humanae Vitae and discovered that the church was firmly coming out against what we're about to look at, the response on the part of parish priests was, all there is the rhythm method. This is all there is. Now, that's not absolutely true, but that is what was thought. That is what was understood. And By that time, there were other things available. Contraceptive technology had begun to be introduced in 1958, 10 years before Humanae Vitae was published. Lazar Margulies developed the so-called Margulies coil, one of the first intrauterine devices. The Lippes loop was available in 1964. Both of these are pieces of plastic. People will say, we don't know exactly how this works. Oh, yes, we do. I mean, we know perfectly well that it is a foreign body introduced into a very delicate part of a woman's body, which necessarily sets up a chronic inflammation. And that chronic inflammation prevents implantation. That is, new life that has been conceived cannot properly implant in the endometrium of the woman's uterus. So effectively, these are abortifacient methods. They're not simply contraceptive. They're preventing new life from being able to find a place to grow and develop. In 1960, the first contraceptive pill, an Ovid, was introduced. And in 1971, a new version of the intrauterine device called the Dalcon Shield caused at least 17 deaths. This is a form of the intrauterine device that was so irritating that it introduced infection, and the settlements, the financial settlements with the families of the women who died as a result of using this device have been estimated around $3 billion. Took about that much to settle the cases. At least 17 deaths were recorded and legally settled. There may have been more. So that was the situation in 1968 when Humanae Vitae was published. Your average parish priest, your average parish educator, as far as they were concerned, the only method available was rhythm or some form of artificial contraception. Now, at that time, there were great strides being made in what we all know as the proper methods of natural family planning. The basal body temperature charting began in the 1940s and continued through the 1960s. There were a variety of people involved in this, people in the US, people in Germany, most famously John Marshall, who was a neurologist in Great Britain, not an OBGYN, but a neurologist. Now the problem with the early forms of basal body temperature charting prior to about 1960 or so was that it was very complex. You practically needed a slide rule. You had to be able to do rather complicated mathematics, but things were refined, and Marshall and his colleagues from the 1960s began to develop basically the methods that are used today, much more straightforward, much less complex, much more easy to teach. And notice the date, the publication of this data, which meant that now it becomes available to the medical world as something reliable. Now it becomes something you can talk about, maybe your parish priest might hear about it, was in 1968. So it was only then that the world became aware that this was a method that was scientifically respectable and acceptable. Yes, it had been spoken about, yes, it was being developed, but the publication in Lancet, which is an internationally respected medical journal published in England, was in 1968. So occasionally people will say, oh, well, it was out there, people knew about it. Not really. I mean, they did not have the data that enabled them to say, this is a method on which we can rely. And in 1971, the Couple-to-Couple League developed and adapted Marshall's findings into what is now referred to as the symptothermal method. Well, beginning in the 60s, and actually they'd begun in the 50s, the Billings in Australia began similarly noting changes in the woman's mucus symptom. Here too, you sometimes run into trouble because priests get really nervous when you have to use the word mucus. So they'd rather not use it at all, and they don't realize that this is a very simple observation that the woman makes every time she goes to the bathroom. It doesn't involve anything weird or strange. It's just, again, it's very straightforward, very simple, but a lot of priests don't know that. The Billings began noting, and beginning in 1962 to 1964, they were able to demonstrate the reliability of observations concerning the cervical mucus pattern. that was observed. And beginning in 64, Lynn Billings began to teach the ovulation method. However, this was in Australia, and the only publication was in a newspaper, not in a medical journal, in 1964. The national or international awareness of the Billings method was really not until 1972, when they were able to publish an article in The Lancet, this very prestigious medical journal, that gave the results of field testing of the Billings method. So all of this gives you some insight into why a lot of priests dragged their feet. They didn't realize that these other methods were available, that they were reliable, that they even existed. And unfortunately, that myth, that mindset, has continued to be transmitted over the years. A lot of priests today simply don't know about the reliability, the effectiveness, and the appropriateness of these kinds of methods, simply because of the perfect storm of contraceptions were available. They thought the only thing Catholics had available was the calendar rhythm method, and the priests felt despair, didn't know what to do. Well, continuing on from the Billings method, the Creighton method, developed principally, or at least popularized and documented medically in medical journals by Dr. Tom Hilgers, took the observations of the mucus symptom to an even more rigorous level and produced even better levels of success in both preventing pregnancy and achieving pregnancy for couples who are using the method to conceive. Well, the other great resource we have available, which has been spoken of so many times and so eloquently at this conference, is of course the Theology of the Body. This wonderful series of catecheses given by Pope John Paul II from 1979 to 1984, in which, and we didn't know it at the time, in which he was taking a book he had already written in Polish but never published, and making it into bite-size catecheses that he could give on Wednesdays. One of the problems involved was that he was taking a book written in Polish, translating it as a Polish speaker into Italian, and our versions would then be taken from Italian and translated into English. And over the years of its publication, there were different translators. So the official, that is to say, the versions of these catecheses on the Vatican website are variable sometimes in terms of the words that are used to translate particular terms. However, the original has been discovered, has been translated into English, and it's available from the Daughters of St. Paul as male and female, he created them, man and woman, he created them. And so you can get the original version of this Theology of the Body, and it's not cut up into individual catecheses, and it has a slightly different arrangement, and it's available for us to use, to read. However, I teach the Theology of the Body as a part of my course on marriage and human sexuality at St. John's Seminary, and I find that even among the theologians, even among the young seminarians, there's a tremendous enthusiasm for the Theology of the Body until they start reading it. And it's like little Orphan Annie eyes, you know. They get really big because it's not easy material. Pope John Paul II, St. John Paul II, was a tremendously gifted philosopher and phenomenologist, and he loves to take individual words, biblical images, and make them the basis of a fantastic discursive reflection on the nature of human knowing and human being and living in the body. And this can sometimes be a little tough for people. Actually, the Theology of the Body has been eloquently condensed down and is available to us in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. If you read the sections of the Catechism on creation, on the fall, and on redemption, on sin, and on marriage, you've got about 90% of the Theology of the Body. There was a deliberate attempt to take as much of those catecheses and to put them into their historical perspective, to rediscover their connections with St. Augustine. So there are ways of teaching the Theology of the Body for those who are kind of afraid of the actual texts themselves, which can be a very fine and very useful way of doing catechesis. Now, I mentioned, and I want to reiterate again, that we live in an era where you have priests who falsely, wrongly imagine that, well, I don't want to raise this question of natural family planning because maybe I don't think it works, or I don't want to talk about mucus, or for whatever reason it might be. My point, the thing I want us to be aware of, is that they will, all of us will be discovering that there are people who are beginning to ask for natural methods and seek them out, not from the church, not necessarily from the websites devoted to natural family planning, but from secular sources. This is a couple, Elna Berglund and Raoul Scherwitzel, her husband, who are physicists. They are not biologists, they are not OBGYNs. These people were working at CERN, one of those great places that was trying to unlock the secrets of subatomic particles, and they're very good at mathematics, and so they decided to apply their knowledge of advanced mathematics and the creation of paradigms to her menstrual cycle. And they came up with an app. Basically what it is a symptothermal method that they think they invented. They imagine they've discovered it, whereas in fact, this has been a matter of study, refinement for decades. And this is being used by 800,000 women in Europe. And they want to break into the American market because you can imagine having made the money that 800,000 users provide means that they have a fair amount in their bankroll, and they are eager to enter the American market. And they probably will. It probably will become more widely known here. There are a variety of reasons for being concerned about and for not directly recommending this to people. But what I'm suggesting is people are going to come to you who are already using this, and you can give them something better. You can suggest to them methods and modalities that are even better. What happens is a woman subscribes. I think there's an annual fee, so if you decide in February you don't like it, your money will still be taken out for the rest of the year because you've decided to go on it for a year. It's based on the usual symptothermal measurement of temperature the very first moment that you wake up, but there is no communication to the users of how this works. Very simple statement of, yes, this is linked to ovulation, temperature rise, temperature fall, but that's it. They have a computer, they keep your data on their computer, and they send the information on your fertility to your app. And so after the temperature reading, you get something like this. It tells you whether or not you are fertile that day. So there's no real charting, there's no real understanding on the part of the woman between this finding and her own physiology. It's someone else is taking care of it. I can depend on their mathematics. Again, there are a whole variety of reasons for being concerned about this, but this is becoming popular. This is an article from 2017, June 27th, from Vogue magazine in England. Now, this is a women's fashion magazine, very popular women's fashion magazine, encouraging and explaining this method because they know their readers want this. Women want a natural method that doesn't involve hormones that will, according to recent studies, have a likelihood of making me depressed and maybe even making me suicidal, or using devices which are setting up a chronic inflammation inside me to prevent pregnancy. Those are not nice things to do. Women want something more natural. So Vogue magazine does a discovery of and explanation of this method to people who might be interesting. Are there side effects? How effective is it? Why should we be concerned? Well, number one, this is what happens on days when a woman is fertile. That's what she's advised. Use protection. Barrier methods are least effective during a woman's fertile period. That's the time when barrier methods are most likely to fail. So it may not be surprising that just last week, was an article in an English publication, a complaint on the part of a woman who said, this method is not working for me. I paid all this money and I got pregnant and I didn't want to be pregnant. Well, if they're encouraging barrier methods during the fertile phase, that's quite understandable. That's a really stupid thing to do. And it's not the sort of thing that any teacher of symptothermal natural family planning would ever advise their clients. So again, we have an edge of many decades of having worked with this and knowing why this isn't such a helpful thing. So, we shouldn't really recommend this natural cycles approach. Complaints of pregnancy, just the basic issue, the founders are physicists. These are not OBGYNs, these are not biologists. They read a few things about human physiology and now they understand it because their math is going to solve all the problems. Well, be careful. There are a number of approaches, as I don't have to tell you, as you can find out from the very helpful displays that are here. Most of the, or if not all, of the providers of programs of natural family planning are developing apps of one kind or another that will enable people who want to be able to use their phones together with their observations and an understanding of their fertility to do that. So the fact that you can do it on your phone is not a unique characteristic of this approach, but this is a popular thing. It is something to be aware of. It will become more and more popular. The other intriguing thing is an article which let's see, if I accompanied that. Well, the intriguing thing about the articles is that after the article complaining about this was another article which said, but women want this. An article in a publication from just last week in a completely secular newspaper saying, this is something people want. Something for us to be aware of, something for us to use in our own approach to helping people understand natural family planning. Well, let's shift back for a moment to Amoris Laetitia. There are a variety of places where specific themes essential in the teaching of natural planning emerge in the document, and you're going to encounter people for whom Amoris Laetitia is the most wonderful thing the church has produced in the last 500 years. And they may have a variety of reasons for believing this or saying this, but for you to be able to say to them, well, absolutely, and there's a powerful recommendation of the naturalness of natural family planning in this document, may help open a few eyes, and eyes perhaps on the part of people who haven't been altogether positively disposed towards natural family planning. Everybody is aware that Pope Francis is concerned for naturalness, for a concern for nature. His document Laudato Si is all about our relationship with the environment. But it isn't just the external environment. He talks about, and this is specifically from Amoris Laetitia, the tyrannizing of nature, our acting against nature as something that reflects our own sinfulness. When we choose not to act in accord with, when we choose to violate what God has created as a natural order, we are tyrannizing nature, brutally ravaging it. And he talks about the environmental effects of this, but he also places the contrast between doing that and engaging in a nuptial embrace. That the alternative to tyrannizing nature can be to enter into a loving, embracing relationship with what is natural. And together with that awareness of nature is the question of self-mastery. Deliberately choosing to abstain from sex during fertile periods, if indeed the avoidance of pregnancy is what one's attempting. There is a specific statement about this in number 151, which is a different section altogether of Amoris Laetitia than the portion that is concerned with natural family planning. Here he says, to those who fear that the training of the passions and of sexuality detracts from the spontaneity of sexual love, St. John Paul II replied that human persons are called to full and mature spontaneity in their relationship, a maturity that is the gradual fruit of a discernment of the impulses of one's own heart. What is it I really desire? What are my deepest desires? This calls for discipline and self-mastery. For every person must learn the meaning of his or her own body. What Pope St. John Paul II calls the language of the body. That we say things with our bodies which are absolutely heard by the person to whom we say them, and it doesn't matter what we say with our mouth. There is a communication of truth with the body that is foundational. Again, quoted, emphasized in Amoris Laetitia. And so, sexuality is not a means of gratification or entertainment. It's an interpersonal language where the other is taken seriously and the human heart comes to participate, so to speak, in another kind of spontaneity. So here you have Pope Francis responding to the criticism that some people will raise. Well, the problem with natural family planning is it takes out the spontaneity in our relationships. He's saying, you know what? There's a more human kind of spontaneity. There's a more human awareness of the other that allows for a spontaneous response based on what it is the other and you in relationship with the other most deeply and most genuinely want. Another theme, another vital and central theme in the context of teaching natural family planning is, of course, accompaniment. The problem with apps, the problem with a book-only approach, is that people will naturally want to ask questions. People will have questions about their own bodies, their own experience, their own observations, and they need someone to ask those questions of. It's not enough to have a Q&A page on your website. There is the need for what Pope Francis has over and over emphasized as accompaniment. Don't abandon people. Don't leave them alone. Provide them with someone with whom they can dialogue, with whom they can move forward together. And so he specifically says, again in number 222, this is a passage we already looked at, the more the couple tries to listen in conscience to God and His commandments and is accompanied spiritually, the more their decisions will be profoundly free of subjective caprice and accommodation to prevailing social mores. So accompaniment, and this can be, as we'll see, priestly accompaniment by a priest who is willing to work with and walk with and continue to hear and to help couples who are struggling and perhaps falling occasionally. But I would say absolutely essential, and maybe even as important or more important, is that accompaniment that a teacher can provide. To provide a context in which there is somebody, some living, breathing human being, as I said, to whom people can turn, of whom they can ask questions. And I love the response that we had just on the Clergy Day when someone was concerned about not having teachers. One of the providers of one of these methods said, well, you know, we have this wonderful thing called the internet. Meaning by that, not just websites, but the ability to have real-time communication with someone where it's not just on the phone. You're seeing their face, you're seeing their lips move, you're seeing their gestures. You can engage in a conversation with someone who lives far, far away. Your teacher doesn't actually need to be in a drivable distance from your house in order for you to be able to have a teacher. That's accompaniment. That's the possibility of going with someone along a path. And that's absolutely essential and central, not only in this, and not only in this document, but throughout Pope Francis's catechesis. He specifically reminds pastors of the necessity to accompany couples, and he's especially talking here about the problem of the divorced and the remarried, and helping them to discover what their real situation is and try to act in accordance with church teaching, despite how this is being sometimes misinterpreted by people. He talks especially about accompaniment in the first years of married life, how essentially important that is, that people, they find themselves especially vulnerable. And here he's talking about the terrible phenomenon of, gosh, maybe she wasn't the one, or maybe he wasn't the one. imagining that marriage is all about constantly having those warm, frothy feelings that existed at the beginning. Well, actually, it's about discovering a new way of loving, a new way of living in relationship with the other. And people need to be accompanied. They need not to be abandoned. They need not to be left alone to their own fantasies that, well, I guess it wasn't real, so I guess it wasn't really marriage, therefore I need to find someone else. He talks about how essential it is for there to be people walking with folks in that context, and he especially suggests that older couples should be available to make themselves available to younger couples. That there should be the formation in parishes of people who are willing to mentor younger newlyweds on the question of their own discovery of what it can be to be in relationship. It could also be helpful to ask older married couples to help younger couples in the neighborhood by visiting them, offering guidance in the early years of marriage. Nowadays, pastoral cares for families has to be fundamentally missionary, going out to where people are. So something one can do in the parish. Certainly this has implications for the teaching of natural family planning, but for so many other areas of life that people will encounter in the early years of marriage as well. And the last principle, although we might have a chance to just glance at the subject of eugenics, is this vitally important idea of the principle of gradualness. And not only gradualness, but always proposing the ideal. Never abandoning people to the state of, well, I guess this is all you can do, so, don't ever bring that up in confession again because, it's not really a sin. You're doing what God wants you to do, so just be content where you are. That's abandonment. That's not proposing the ideal. That's not allowing people, not allowing the Holy Spirit to touch the lives and hearts of people and to enable them to move forward and to make progress. That's not accompaniment. And so Pope Francis reminds people of something that already existed in, to some extent, in Humanae Vitae. It certainly exists in the Catechism. We could look at it there. We can look at where it's also mentioned in this beautiful document by Pope St. John Paul II, Familiaris Consortio. St. John Paul II proposed the so-called law of gradualness in the knowledge that the human being knows, loves, and accomplishes moral good by different stages of growth. We fail periodically. We need to get up. We need, like a coach, someone who can say, okay, let's get up, let's try it again, let's continue moving towards that goal. There needs to be a willingness to walk with, to be present to people, not to berate them, not to feel that just because they failed or fallen on this occasion that they can't get back up again and continue moving towards the goal. This is also especially true in the confessional. How much of a purpose of amendment does the person need in order to receive absolution? I mean, sometimes you encounter confessors who imagine that you can't possibly be forgiven unless you give certainty that this is never going to happen again. Well, I'm not sure I've ever received absolution if that's the case. Because in fact, that kind of certainty is very, very rare. What one needs as a confessor is the person's genuine conviction that they are going to do what they can to try to move towards the goal that you have again presented before them. Encourage them again to move towards that goal. Again, never abandoning people to say, well, I guess that's all you can do. That's all God ever wants you to be. Don't ever allow anybody to make you feel guilty for not trying to be something more. That's abandonment. Accompaniment means, and this is something that he mentions again, people advance gradually with the progressive integration of the gifts of God, the demands of God's definitive and absolute love in his or her entire personal and social life. It's not a matter of saying, well, okay, don't bring that up in the confessional again. No, the confessional is the place where you can bring it so that you can recognize that this is a part of your life where you want to receive grace and discover the possibility to move forward, even though that progress may be very slow. And The final aspect of this in terms of the law of gradualness is you always propose the ideal. And here again, these are all things taken from Amoris Laetitia. In order to avoid all misunderstanding, I would point out that in no way must the church desist from proposing the full ideal of marriage, God's plan in all of its grandeur. A lukewarm attitude, a relativism, or an undue reticence in proposing that ideal would be a lack of fidelity to the gospel and also a lack of love on the part of the person who is ministering to them. So this principle of gradualness is not the same thing as justifying mistakes or falling, but it is a constant reassurance of the individual that progress is always possible, even though progress may be slow. The final thing that we really don't have a chance to look at in detail, and it's a fascinating subject in itself, is that another aspect, and I think this will become increasingly clearer as time goes by, is that Amoris Laetitia, but especially Humanae Vitae, fits into a very beautiful spectrum of the church's rejection of eugenics. That is the idea that we're going to build a better race by eliminating the unfit. The problem is the definition of the unfit. If one looks, for example, at the history of this terrible practice, often it's attributed to people like Charles Darwin, but in fact Darwin himself said we must bear the undoubtedly bad effect of the weak surviving and propagating their kind. Darwin was never in favor of eliminating the unfit, according to someone's definition. It was his cousin Francis Galton, whom I have to admit was an important scientist who did a lot of mathematical research and is still quoted in textbooks of genetics because of his contributions, but the man was a thoroughgoing racist. The thing that one finds is that promoters of eugenics somehow always imagine that the groups whose reproductive capacity should be limited are always groups other than their own. My people are never the ones who should have fewer children. It's those others, whatever those others may be. They should have fewer children because, well, the children of my group are better, and they're the kind of folks that you want to inherit the earth. Unfortunately, this model, this idea based on the elimination of the unfit, was the basis of a very widespread movement. Friedrich Nietzsche, who some folks love as a philosopher, I find him extremely problematic. He encouraged the prevention of reproduction, even castration, in the case of people who were psychologically, psychiatrically unfit. And lamentably, the place where eugenics was most widely practiced in the early 20th century was not the Weimar Republic or the National Socialists of Germany in the 1930s and 40s. It was in the good old USA, and the state that did the most eugenic sterilization of all states was California. Sacramento received a congratulation letter from the National Socialists of Germany in the late 1930s extolling our policies of forcibly sterilizing those who were regarded as psychiatrically unfit to reproduce. Remember, there was no DSM-3, 4, or 5 in the early 1900s. The definition of what constituted schizophrenia or any kind of psychiatric illness was much more subjective. There are instances of people who were sterilized because they could not speak any language that was spoken at the center where they were received as immigrants, and they were thought to be babbling, and then they were afraid, and then they were sterilized. The eugenics movement was very widespread, and it was only the horrors of World War II and the Nuremberg trials that revealed this to us. Well, we're several decades away from that now, and we've begun to forget. And the same mindset is creeping in, although the unfit are being variably described. They're no longer the psychiatrically unfit, or they are the genetically unfit. And I would only say by way of closing that Amoris Laetitia and Humanae Vitae are reminders of the fact that in the wake of this very powerful movement, which became subdued after World War II and is again reviving, the strongest and really the only voice in objection against it was the Catholic Church. So be aware of the importance of our voices, and as I said, take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves. Again, it's all available on the website. Use it as you wish. Thank you all very much.